Hey there! We're celebrating 10 years at the Allender Center. And to kick things off, we're going to be looking back and sharing stories, remembering how we got to where we are today. In this episode, you'll hear from myself, Dan, Becky Allender, and Jeanette White, our Interim Senior Director, about how the Allender Center first came to be. We hope you enjoy.
10 years. Well, the fact is, I think it's actually 12, but we are celebrating our 10th anniversary as the Allender Center. And Rachael, today we've got two very central people to the beginning of the Allender Center, and that is my wife, Rebecca, and Jeanette White. And so as we reflect on the reality that we are here at a real moment of celebration. Yet the fact is, I just finished with some of my colleagues a very long, glorious weekend. And frankly, I feel like I'm reflecting on 10 years that have been a long, good, hard battle. And there's, frankly, a lot of grief, a lot of joy, and everything that the Allender Center has been and done has to bear the reality of this kind of complexities. And one of the reasons I want folks to keep listening, even if they go, look, good for you. You got 10 years under your belt. But I was actually hoping for some real information. We're going to talk a little bit behind the scenes, but really the premise is this. Anything looks far better when it's on the internet or on Facebook than what it is actually in life. And so to hold the reality that we've all been able to do some remarkable things and have been very significant in many people's lives, but there has been a cost and also a privilege. And we want to be able to name that for us. I want to turn first to my beloved wife and say, how did you first hear of this thing called the Allender Center?
Well, it's true. I go back, it's 12 years. And when I first heard from Keith Anderson that he had envisioned an organization with our last name on it, I was like furious because Dan already has, grades papers. He had already done radio shows. He'd already done a couple of different schools. And even he was an associate pastor. And so there was fundraising for that. And there's been fundraising our whole married life in that regard. So to me, I was horrified because that would be one more thing to fundraise for. And I wasn't even thinking of the work. I'm just thinking, how do we have more hours in our lives for you to fundraise for anything else? But I knew that Keith really respected me. He cared for me. I respected Keith. I knew that he understood the place of a wife, and we had an affection for one another because no one just has a job that's one person, at least in Christian ministry. So I'm like, okay, sort of. And so began the search for who would actually be the director.
Well, I knew, I said to Keith at the very, very beginning, look, if I've got to organize this, I'm good to work with people. I'm good to actually train. I'm good to supervise. But if I've got to organize, we all know that I and everybody else would be in trouble. And that's where he said, Kathy Lorzell, who will be on at some point as we talk about these origins, the reality is she stepped in and in her brilliance created some of the very core structure that has indeed gotten us into the place that we're in. But nonetheless, there was something about the image, the possibility of engaging story and trauma that felt so compelling that it just couldn't be ignored. So we entered in with ambivalence.
You kind of skipped the first year because we had to find, in the beginning it wasn't Kathy. So there was a lot to do that first year of prayer and other people excited for it and me just saying, don't you get it? it's another thing for Dan to fundraise for. So anyways.
Well, and I would love to get your perspective, Rachael, Jeanette, as to when you began to see this entity come to exist and what it was like for you.
Well, I wanted to just interject because I think it might be helpful for our audience to hear a little bit more backstory, because some of you may not know who Keith is and he's being talked about because he's so familiar to us. But Dr. Keith Anderson is the former president of the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, where the Allender Center is housed. He is the president. Dan, who I know followed you as the founding president of the Seattle School. And I think this is also something good for people to know. And Becky, this is what you're alluding to. You guys have a long history, many decades long history of offerings and schools and healing offerings. And so many people, Dan, came to do work with you and Becky with recovery weeks. Story workshops were happening before this kind of creation of the Allender Center. And so I know Keith was kind of looking at this season of your life, looking at the kind of trajectory of graduate students and your work with the graduate school. And I know pushing you using words like legacy and these other words that even just, if people could see your face right now, they would know how you feel about a word like that. And so when you say 12 years, you're talking about these kind of conversations that started to happen with the president of the Seattle School to say, Dan and Becky, here's something I'm dreaming about, I'm thinking about, and you guys are having these conversations, which then lead to, executive director, that starts to become very real, like this sense of, okay, and now we're actually going to hire people to create this thing. And Kathy Lorzell is stepping in to help actually start, building some legs. And so I would say I had worked with you on the Sabbath book that you wrote. And I was in your classes as a graduate student in my MDiv program. But the Sabbath book research project felt very academic. Like it felt very like, we're studying this Sabbath research and, I'm getting to get acquainted with your teaching and your material. Becky, I don't think you and I had met when I was a student, other than maybe at like some kind of school function, like maybe graduation, I think before that. And so at the time, conferences as a part of the Seattle School, you had several conferences. And one of them that was happening was in conjunction with the Sabbath book. So there was a Sabbath conference that we were doing that was story work with people around play and desire and their capacity to Sabbath. And Kathy and you, and I don't even remember who else, said, hey, would you like to come with your kind of knowledge of this Sabbath work? Would you like to come do one of these Sabbath workshops with us? And I believe at the time I was still a student. And I was like, me? What? I'm an MDiv student. I'm not a counseling student. I'm not trying to do therapy. Everyone keeps trying to get me to become a therapist and I'm trying to be a pastor. And, because when you go to seminary at a predominantly counseling school, you kind of start feeling like, maybe I could be more financially stable. Like that could be a good idea. So I kind of got pulled into this conference experience. And it was around, I didn't know these conversations were happening. This dreaming was happening about maybe being able to create a more established place to house this work and to train people to carry on this work. And so kind of from that, more conversations started happening with me. Would you be interested in being a part of this center we're going to create, where we're going to train people and, keep housing story workshops and, different things. And I do remember at the time really being like, why me? Like, are you guys sure? Are you sure you picked, are you sure you're inviting the right kind of person? This was right as I was graduating from seminary, and, I worked at a loose leaf tea shop because I am someone who believes in taking a break whenever you've been in like extreme academic institutions, especially if it is religious of any nature. So this is my year of like, I'm going to take a year off before I launch into what's next. I'm going to work at the tea shop in Ballard. I'm going to serve people tea and make crepes. And then this invitation came to spend a year with a group of people learning together, training together, and seeing if we could build something together to kind of launch a program or an offering beyond the story workshops and recovery weeks, which were already ongoing. I know there were many more people involved in those formative conversations that maybe didn't get invited to be a part of the core at that time. So I'm also aware with any origin story, there are people that get left out who contributed. And so I always think of that in my place to be invited and the privilege to be invited. And I had no idea what I was signing up for me 10 years ago, because it was, I guess more like 11, that origin year where we were meeting together and doing story work together and trying to see if there was any way we could create a training started in 2010, 2011. But our first program that we got to offer as the Allender Center was in the fall of 2011. And, there's so much more I could say, but that is certainly, I thought this is something I'll try out. I'll do, as I'm working at the tea shop and, try to kind of get some of my own training. This is really important work to be able to do good, informed narrative, trauma-informed narrative work with people. And I loved being a part of healing, and I was a pastor. So to get to do pastoral work in such a concentrated, unique kind of way, it had changed my life. So the thought of getting to continue doing this work with a community of people, and many who happen to be just dear friends. And I do remember when Jeanette White was also a part of things. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jeanette.
Good to be with you guys today. It's really fun to listen to some of the stories, because some of those were happening before I joined you all. And I came in, what was it? Like the summer of 2010. And again, that was before the Allender Center had a website. Like it was this sort of thing that was more talked about, like, oh, we're starting the Allender Center. And I just remember thinking a lot, my role when I was hired was manager of conferences and events for the Seattle school as a whole. And yes, the bulk of that was Dan's world. Dan, I think you had, we were multiple conferences all over the nation each year. You were in, speaking engagements galore. Like my whole world was just managing so much of your day to day. Yes. But I remember it must have been several months into when I had started that position, Kathy had handed me, I don't know if I remember it feeling thick, but it was probably like maybe 10 to 20 pages stapled together, and on the front it just said, like the Allender Center. And so to me, the Allender Center started literally as a set of papers handed to me, and I'm trying to read and understand, what is this that we're starting? What are we beginning? We have this kind of a vision. And for those of you who know Kathy, she's a deeply gifted entrepreneurial visionary person. And so she has it all mapped out in her head, and I'm trying to understand it on paper. And really, my role at that time was to make sure things happen. We get the venue, we get the people in the door, we, get facilitators to where they need to go, those things. And it was a small operation at that point too. I still remember it does very much feel like, even though things with Dan's work, this work had been going on a few years prior. It was the fall of 2011 when we all went to St. Louis together for our very first, at that time, it was the lay and advanced counseling certificate. And getting to all travel together. There was this kind of this troop of us that would get ready to go, kind of go and spend these really rich, but highly dramatic, sounds a little bit dramatic, but dramatic weekends together, because we're engaged in working with, I think we had 42 participants with us that very first year, and getting into story work outside of just that individual weekend, right? Like we had story workshops prior, had recovery weeks, but this was that first foray into that extended work with people over the course of a year. So to get to journey with everyone through that. Me kind of I'm on much more the administrator side of it. But it was very exciting, and it was a delight to get to see what was happening for I think all the work that had happened prior to me kind of coming in, right? The year that you all had spent meeting together. There was maybe 7 or 8 of you in the beginning, doing all that story work together, thinking about how you could translate this into a training and what that would mean for people in their lives as they were to take this, right, and begin to apply it in their own context. I think there was a lot of energy, a lot of hope, a lot of laughter, a lot of team dinners with Dan telling just horribly embarrassing stories about himself. That just gave us all a really great laugh. Sorry, Dan, that you...
I won't go through any of the stories, not today.
No, but they were so good and so terrible. But yeah, just for all of us to be together during that first year or so was just deeply formative for the team. I think each of us as individuals, the relationships that were crafted over sort of through the work together.
Well, I've always argued that there should be this intersection of reluctance, but also deep honor and joy in all of what we do as we attempt to serve the kingdom of God. And even as we're talking, I remember how much joy, just how much fun it was, while simultaneously being, what are we doing? And I'll go back that St. Louis had some severe struggles in warfare as we were attempting to launch something we didn't even quite know what we were doing, yet knew the material. We knew material, but we didn't know how to, in many ways, bring it out over a 3 or 4 week period of time. And with the intersection of such excitement, joy, confusion, struggle, I hope most people hear this well. You can't be called to create and know what you're going to do. Simultaneously, you can't engage without some level of excitement and joy, yet it so often gets intermingled with the complexity of what Becky was putting words to, I was putting words to, and that is, I don't know if I want to do this. I don't know where this is going to go. There's a lot of risk in this. And as we began to see, and I'll just use a simple word, more success, defined in this terms as people were really growing. And there was more desire for the material in people's lives. It seemed to confirm, take away a little bit of the chaos and the ambivalence. But I certainly know as I look back over these 10 years, there have just been mileposts where I've been blown away by the goodness of God. And yet, on the other hand, staggered at something both of the cost for myself, but for many others. There's been a lot of failure and a lot of goodness all combined. And I just don't think we really talk about that reality enough. Either we're complaining that it's just been hard and hurtful and not forgetting the realm of just joy and gratitude, or vice versa. So I'm curious for all three of you all, what 1 or 2 events just linger that hold together something of that intersection of joy, exhaustion, and struggle?
Some of the mishaps that happen along the way, just of having a program that runs and it's on the road, right? Because in the early years in particular, almost all of our things were held elsewhere. And I think it was my first weekend traveling with Dan. And we were in Florida, and so I'm still getting to know Dan as well. He's still getting to know me, and I'm there to kind of be the handler in some ways for the weekend and make sure that it was a large conference we were doing at that time goes well, and had picked him up. I think I picked you up at your hotel, and we were going to go to lunch or something before going to the church for the conference that night. And I pick him up and start backing out of the hotel parking lot, and I run into somebody else's car who's parked. Oh, no. And I was in a rental car where for me, I mean, I've driven like a 1995 Corolla my whole life. I know all the ins and outs, all the window, right? Like what you can see, what you can't see. Had not taken into account that this rental car had this huge, what is it? Like the headrest behind the driver's seat. And I realized I couldn't see and I didn't know it because I just was in auto mode of like, this is how I'm used to operating in my car. Backed right into it. And so that was how our relationship began.
And let me just say that backed into it sounds like a little like a bump. This wasn't a bump. We had an accident.
Yeah, there was a nice chunk dent in this person's car. So that was some of our beginnings. So definitely a little bit bumpy and hilarious too. I mean, I think I'm sure I was laughing out of like both like mortification and whatnot. But it was also funny.
Well, at least my experience, I don't remember you laughing. I remember laughing. It's not catastrophic. We've done no harm ultimately to a human being. Insurance will cover this. But you were mortified. And I don't think it was helpful for me to be laughing. I think there was a pretty significant insensitivity, but it was just so hilarious. This is our first time practically in the car working together. And you remember we went to lunch.
Yes.
I can almost tell you what I had. And, just having to address the fact of, gee, are you going to step into the sense of shame you feel? Like we're having to do work. And it's like, oh, come on, Dan, just have lunch. But it's so clear that if we're going to be able to work together, we've got to be able to work this story out if what we're going to do is engage story in the next few moments as we go to a conference. So, yeah, it's not one of the more severe things that we've gone through together, but it always marks for me one of our first engagements.
Yeah, no, I can laugh now. I remember laughing, but apparently I did not. I will take your word for it at that time. But it does kind of speak to just the rockiness, right, of this. I mean, you even saying like, oh, we entered into conversation about like shame or things like that. Like those aren't normal colleague conversations or things that you're having. And so that's been like both like the beauty and the pain, I think, right, of an organization where we've had a lot of depth in relationship and connection, and that also is like costly in different ways. I mean, it was wonderful and welcome at that time, and also awkward because we didn't have as much established. But yeah, I think kind of the mishap thing, though. One other story I was gonna share that. When all of us had gone, we were so excited. We were offering the story workshop down in the Los Angeles area at Mariners Church. And I had worked so hard to get our whole team ready to go. And there at that time, my role was to do a lot of the organization for the travel still and all of those pieces. We got there, everybody's at the church, the event is starting. I call this beautiful Airbnb that I had booked for us, like on the water, right? Like it's going to be this wonderful stay, whole team. Well, they double booked and we no longer had anywhere to stay for a team of like 13 people or something. So just that the sort of the constant edge of like, we've got everything working, whether it's program, whether it's teaching, whether it's the prep that I'm talking about, like kind of those logistical pieces, and you have to pivot. I think the quick movement to just adjust to what is happening in the moment with the center has been, it's just been a big part of our lives this past decade, is finding our way forward with kind of the next piece that maybe came out of an unexpected opportunity, if you want to put it in the good, like the positive shift, or was like, oh gosh, what do we do now? So I just thought of that as we were talking about like running into cars and not having any place to stay, and what do we do now? I think that we are an organization that has learned to pivot and to kind of team up and figure out a way forward. But there's been a lot of adrenaline and cortisol in this work.
I think it's part of the exhaustion is that when you join other people in their trauma stories, your body cannot help but be somewhat vicariously traumatized at the level of cortisol arousal. And so much of the uncertainty of a decade has created a long series of highs and lows, and then, normal middles, but eccentricity and severity has been a byproduct of a lot of our work.
Yeah, I mean, your question is such a good one. And when I'm thinking about why we mark anniversaries to begin with, and it is that sense of pausing to remember and to reflect and to say thank you and to lament and to kind of set up Ebenezer's to remember where God has been with you and to imagine what does it look like moving into a next season based on how far you've journeyed and then knowing you have so much further to journey. And so when I think about the past decade, like where are those moments? I think for me, they're not as located I certainly have so many stories that are so like precious to me of interactions with our team, interactions, like the holy privilege of holding stories of people, the sheer amount of people I've had the profound privilege of entering story space with together collectively. I mean, it's like, man, I'm just going to get teary-eyed even thinking about it. So for me, I think I'll speak more thematically, certainly to be invited to be a part of labor that feels like all of your gifts are getting to come to the table in a really unique way. I think for me, that holy privilege of actually being with people in a really particular, unique way, that to me is that intersection of such deep joy and gratitude and sorrow. I think and for a long season, I don't know if I would say it's true at this particular juncture, but for a long season, like an official pastor of the Allender Center, one of many. I think when you are someone who sees all the stories, holds all the stories, is paying attention to who we are and who we're called to be, there is such a joy in that, and there is such a cost to that. I think about the many people who are still a part of things, and I think about the many people who, for like a myriad of reasons, needed to depart, and people that came for certain seasons and helped build beautiful things, and people who left because this wasn't like a good place for them to be. And I think anyone who's been a part of building something new, whether it's a church or a nonprofit or just a dream that you have, you hold those stories. And there are many people that contribute to the building. And so when you hold like where it's been really good and amazing, and then you also hold where it did not go well and you made huge mistakes and you're learning and, you're pivoting and you're having to recreate. And so I think even if you were to talk to our staff and our team members who have come into the Allender Center in different generations, we've done storytelling in that way, and different stories are told about different ways people experience coming into this organization based on the infrastructure and support we had at different seasons. And so I think, it feels a little bit like, I've only been married almost 2 years. So it feels a little bit like what happens when you get to a 10-year anniversary of a marriage and you have to take stock of just the journey you've been on together, and where there's been wounding and where there has been like a deeper growing of love.
And I know for Becky, she began as our first intercessor, accompanying us alone to St. Louis several times, and then eventually growing something of our intercessional team. But I think your story is actually fairly bizarre in terms of coming from being an intercessor into actually becoming part of the program.
Well, it is. I think as you've listened to Jeanette and Dan and Rachael, that you see that they were kind of in the foxhole together. They were really on the front lines. And I think Jeanette, not completely in the foxhole, but a foxhole because she's a graduate among her cohort. And so I think I'm putting you in the foxhole too, Jeanette. And my situation, I mean, there were 3 or 4 times we went to St. Louis. 4. I loved going, but it was I was all alone, not in a foxhole. I was in a heavenly realm, so to speak, combating forces that with story work, if you're familiar with story work, you know that if you do really good work and if you have a really good story guide, you're going to be changing the generations. Like you're going to break some significant vows, and you're going to change and you're going to grow. And so it's really, really holy work. And so the last lunch, meeting with them, they all had this greater love than I felt. And the person who had given the seed money for the entire time of flying all of us to St. Louis was the man taking us to the airport. And I was in the back seat, and I was not in a good place because I felt left out where they had all had a victory together. And he just kept saying, Becky, this will never work without you. Becky, this will, and he had no idea what I was feeling or the conversation over lunch that had occurred. And so it was really a sad time for me not knowing. But with the summer, I knew it was good work. So I showed up again, and we had other people pray with me. But then that got hard for me, that I realized I can't keep doing this because my heart was being awakened to the story work that I was listening to other people having and the teachings of the Allender Center. So it was then that I realized I'm going to be miserable and quit, or I'm going to have the courage to say, I want to go through this training too. So that's when my whole life really changed in significant ways. So there's a very good ending, whereas in the beginning I had a lot of reluctance. So I'm very, very thankful and grateful.
And it's such a strange thing still after a lot of conversations to realize that where we were was good, but the work you began to do in your story, you had not done before. And it began to open up domains for you and therefore for me. And it's such a strange thing to be teaching somebody who happens also to be your wife, who also brings back to our lives things I'm not addressing, but I'm asking you to address. So I think it has been one of the ironies that this whole process of trying to be of some help to others to engage their story well has just given us and our marriage and our friendship a life-giving presence. I think I've been changed by the Allender Center. Not to say there is not vastly more for redemption to bring, but I look back over this decade and say, we're more in love. We have more joy and we have more grief together, but in that we have more passion than we would have had if somehow Keith Anderson had not knocked on the door and said, let's deal with your legacy. So as we're talking about both grief, but joy, excitement, the youth of our beginnings, before we end, I just kind of want to ask, why do you keep doing it?
I would say for myself, it's the people. And I mean that in twofold. It's the people that we get to serve and the stories that we get to hear over and over again about lives that have been so richly impacted that obviously never gets old and is just continuously incredible to see how many people we get to reach and how this work gets to take root in their lives and manifest itself in whatever way that might be, whether it's primarily their own personal healing, or they're coming here to be trained to try and bring this outward. So I think that's one side. And then it's the people in the center and the people that I get to work with. And I've always felt like you can love a job, but if you don't love the people there, it has a bit of a shelf life to it. Same way we used to say, like, well, in some ways it doesn't matter where you live as long as you have the community there that like would sustain. You may not love the city or something, but it's the people there that make it worthwhile to be there. So I just know for me that the team of people are so wonderful. This is such a loyal, just deeply relational group of people who are desiring to move towards something in a common goal. And there obviously, of course, there's been a lot of friendships that have been deeply meaningful as well. You kind of can't help that over such a long season of being colleagues together. But yeah, I think it's the people that we get to serve and the people that I get to work with. That's why I stay.
I think when you do this work, you do meet people, and then you do understand and see people in a way that you don't normally get to have the privilege. So it's so holy that sometimes I feel like I want to be like Jonah and say no, but not very often. It's mainly so holy that how could you stop? How could you ever say no? Because it's such a privilege to be a part of watching someone's redemption, watching someone's growth and victory. It's just the best.
Yeah, I think I would echo both what Jeanette and Becky, what you've named, and I would just add there's a deep sense of calling to this work at such a time as this. And as we are in this season of we've had incredible partnerships along the way. I know we've talked about our partnership with the Impact Movement and the places where I see God providing and saying, keep going, there's more for you. And so not just like me personally, but the Allender Center as a whole, and trying to be faithful, being faithful to keep saying yes where I'm called to say yes. And so I think in addition to a deep alignment with our mission and belief in this work, and the gratitude I have to work with incredible people, I think what keeps me at the table is a sense of calling.
Yeah, and to go ditto, probably is not the best way to end, but I was looking at Paul's use of the word joy. And normally we think it's joy and the Lord. Indeed, those are what the songs are about. But actually, Paul's joy is primarily those that he served with. And so it really returns to our joy is being engaged in those stories where we not only have the privilege of being used for the sake of someone's redemption, but where there's redemption on our own behalf. So I think that's in part what I would say I remain, because I know how deeply I need redemption. There's been such good, and I can say I'm so grateful for each one of you. We would not be the organization we are. And to not say that there are grave room for change and repentance, but also great glory of what we have become in 10 years. So it is an honor and truly a privilege to serve with all three of you and many others. Happy anniversary, folks. Hi, this is Dan.
And this is Kathy Lorzell.
And Kathy, do you know that the two of us wrote a book that's coming out this fall? I'm assuming you do, but I want to just say we wrote a book together.
We wrote a book. It's called Redeeming Heartache. And we really wrote it for anyone who's struggling with unaddressed pain from their past and who wants to understand why they're struggling with what they're struggling with in the present. And this book will help you understand how the story of your wounding is not a failure or something that can't be understood, but it's an invitation to your purpose and your divine calling. And it is available for pre-order right now. And if you pre-order it before its release date of September 14th, you get bonus content, Dan.
Does that include that you'll show up at people's homes and make them dinner?
I would love to do that. People should just let me know when they need dinner and I will show up. I am an Italian grandma at heart.
No, the extra content is just us reflecting on some of the core themes of the book. And really, our task is to say that to name the truth about life is a risky walk on the wild side. But look, when adversity and suffering are significant, that wild walk of engaging the reality of trauma is really the only way we're going to see life itself.
So if you want to join us in our celebration of the book, we're actually doing a live conference based on the content of the book. And for those of you who have been longtime listeners, we're talking about orphan, widow, stranger, and redeeming those parts of ourselves into prophet, priest, and king and queen. It's going to be a great day, September 18th. So buy the book, come to the conference, and it's not just for folks who have read the book. Really, we're going to cover a lot of the content, and then it'll be a great way to move you into the book when it arrives on your doorsteps.
Look, I'm not usually the one to deal with details, but nonetheless, what date is this event happening, Kathy?
September 18th. September 18th. It'll be a lot of fun.
Well, soon after that, Kathy and I and my wife Becky are packing up and heading out to Montana to do an intimate mystery conference. And we'll be doing that October 1st and 2nd in Bozeman, Montana, one of the finest places in the world to fly fish. But if you're unable to travel to Montana, we still have the option for you to attend the event from the comfort of your own home with a live stream ticket, but that live stream ticket will not enable you to do any fly fishing.
Or hang out with me, Dan, and the team. We are so excited to get back on the road. Even in the midst of this craziness, we are excited to see all of your faces. Intimate Mystery is a unique weekend that invites you into a place of newfound awareness and ability to engage conflict and desire in any type of relationship. So it's for partners, couples, people who are wanting to get into a relationship, even people who are working through the edges of divorce. This is one of those spaces that will help you understand your own style of relating and how you do that within relationships.
Yeah, it's so important to underscore that this is an invitation to understand what intimacy calls forth, uniquely in marriage, but in all relationships, including a relationship with God. You can find more information about these events and more about our work at www, or like 3 W's and a dot, and then the Allender Center.org. Looking forward to being with you.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.